Evan had always preferred solitude. It wasn't that he despised people. He simply found the silence of the wilderness more honest, more predictable. Born and raised in the concrete jungle of Seattle, he had spent the first 27 years of his life suffocating under the weight of deadlines, city lights, and the constant hum of traffic. The noise never stopped. It burrowed into his skull, made his skin itch. He had tried to ignore it, tried to live the life he was supposed to live, college, a corporate job, a relationship that eventually crumbled under the pressure of expectations. But deep down, he had always known he didn't belong there. So, 5 years ago, he walked away from it all. He sold his car, quit his job, and packed up only what he could carry. His destination? A tiny, weather-beaten cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness. A place where the only sounds were the whispering wind and the distant calls of wolves. It was brutal, unforgiving, and exactly what he needed. Life out here was simple, but it was not easy. His days were spent hunting, chopping wood, reinforcing his shelter against the relentless cold, and making the occasional supply run to a tiny outpost town 40 miles south. He had learned how to trap, how to track, how to distinguish between a safe river crossing and a death trap hidden under thin ice. The land demanded respect, and Evan gave it willingly. But it was the nights that were the hardest. There were no streetlights here, no sirens wailing in the distance. Just darkness, a vast, consuming blackness that stretched endlessly beyond his frosted windows. The only company he had was the fire in his hearth and the thoughts he tried not to entertain. Memories of the life he had left behind, the woman he once loved, the father he never reconciled with before the old man died. He told himself he didn't miss human contact, that he had chosen this life because he was better off alone. Most nights he almost believed it, but not tonight. Tonight, something was outside. Evan woke to the sound of heavy thudding against the wooden porch. He stayed still, his heartbeat slow but steady, his senses immediately alert. A second later, the thudding came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. No, not knocks. Something heavier. His first thought was the wind. Storms could send loose branches flying against the cabin, and he had experienced nights where the howling gusts rattled the very foundation of his home. But this was different. Rhythmic. Intentional. Someone or something was out there. Moving with practiced precision. Evan slipped out of bed and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. Though it felt familiar in his grip, an extension of himself. He moved soundlessly across the room, his bare feet making no noise against the cold floorboards. He peered through the frosted window, breath slow, controlled. At first he saw nothing but white. Snow had fallen heavy that evening, covering the ground in an unbroken blanket. His cabin stood alone in the vast landscape, its chimney sending a thin wisp of smoke into the freezing night. Then movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the porch. Evan's grip tightened on the rifle. He inched toward the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Heavy breathing. Low, steady. Not human. Bear. His pulse quickened. Bears rarely came this close to his cabin. They usually kept to the tree line, scavenging for whatever scraps they could find. But this one was right on his porch. Evan carefully unlatched the door and swung it open just enough to see. And there she was. A massive mother grizzly stood only a few feet away, her thick fur dusted with snow, her breath curling into the frozen air. Even in the dim light, he could see her muscles tense beneath her winter coat, her large black eyes locked onto him. And beneath her, 3 tiny cubs huddled together, trembling. Evan's instinct screamed at him to raise the rifle. A bear that close was a threat. No matter how desperate it looked, it was still a wild animal, and wild animals followed instinct, not reason. If she decided to charge, he wouldn't have time to react. He had seen what a single swipe from a grizzly's paw could do to a man. He took a step back, shifting the rifle higher. But then he hesitated. The mother bear didn't move. She didn't growl, didn't snarl, didn't show any signs of aggression. She simply stood there, watching him, her massive body partially shielding her cubs from the wind. The little ones pressed against her legs, their tiny bodies shaking violently. She wasn't hunting. She was freezing. Evan swallowed hard, his breath visible in the cold air. He had seen desperate animals before, starving wolves, half-dead moose struggling through the brutal winter. But this was different. This wasn't just an animal fighting to survive. This was a mother trying to keep her young alive. And somehow, someway, she had come here. To him, the rifle in his hands suddenly felt heavier. Evan wasn't foolish enough to believe that animals thought the way humans did. But as he looked into the bear's dark, intelligent eyes, he saw something there. Not just need, not just survival. A plea. He exhaled slowly, his fingers still resting on the trigger, but he didn't pull it. His mind warred with itself. This was insane. A bear had come to his home. A predator. Letting her linger here was an obvious risk. One wrong move, one shift in behavior, and she could tear through the door with little effort. But if he sent her away now, if he shut the door and turned his back, would she even make it through the night? The cubs were small, too small. They should have been hibernating deep in a den, curled up safely against their mother. But for whatever reason, they weren't. Something had driven them from their shelter. Hunger, a fallen tree, another predator. Evan didn't know. All he knew was that they wouldn't last out here much longer. The mother bear took a step closer, her massive paws pressing into the snow. She made no sound, no sudden movements. Evan's grip tightened on the rifle. His pulse thundered in his ears. What the hell was he supposed to do? He had lived in this wilderness for years. He had seen nature at its most beautiful, at its most cruel. He knew the rules, knew that mercy wasn't always an option. But tonight, as he stood there, staring into the desperate eyes of a mother fighting for her children, he wasn't sure he could turn her away. Evan had spent years in the unforgiving wilderness, and in all that time, he had learned that survival was built on instinct, caution, and a deep respect for nature's brutal laws. He had also learned that mercy was a luxury few could afford. There was no place for kindness in the wild, no room for hesitation when faced with danger, and certainly no second chances when life and death hung in such a delicate balance. And yet, as he stood in the open doorway of his cabin, the bitter wind howling around him like a living thing, his rifle held in steady hands, he found himself staring into the dark, unblinking eyes of a creature that should have been his enemy, but wasn't. The mother bear remained completely still, her massive body dusted with frost, her breath coming in slow, visible clouds that swirled in the icy night air. She was enormous, her sheer size and strength undeniable. But there was something else there, something that made Evan hesitate even as every instinct screamed at him to act. She wasn't threatening him. She wasn't baring her teeth or stamping her paws or doing any of the things a bear might do when cornered. She was simply standing there, silent and unmoving, the weight of the world pressed into the heavy set of her shoulders. And at her feet, 3 tiny cubs huddled together, their fragile bodies trembling violently in the cold. Evan's fingers tightened around the rifle. His pulse thundered in his ears, his mind warring against itself. This was madness. A bear this close. So close he could hear the faint wheeze of her breath, see the delicate frost clinging to the edges of her fur, was a danger beyond reason. The only thing standing between him and a violent mauling was the thin sliver of restraint she was showing now, but that could change in an instant. He knew how quickly wild animals could turn, how the smallest miscalculation could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to shut the door. The cubs let out pitiful whimpers, their tiny paws sinking into the snow, their faces half buried in their mother's fur as they desperately sought warmth. The sight of them, so impossibly small against the vast emptiness of the frozen world, struck something deep inside Evan, something buried beneath years of hardened isolation and survival instincts. He had seen death before, had accepted its quiet, inevitable presence in the wild, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a mother trying to keep her children alive. A sharp gust of wind cut through the night, biting at Evan's exposed skin, and the bear's fur rippled in response, her body tensing as if bracing against the elements. It was too cold, even with her thick coat. Even with every ounce of strength she had left, she wouldn't be able to protect them for much longer. The cubs were too young, too weak, and if he did nothing, if he turned them away now, he knew exactly what would happen. Evan exhaled slowly, the warmth of his breath immediately swallowed by the frigid air. He didn't move at first, didn't shift his weight or lower his rifle, but inside something shifted. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to walk away, to let nature take its course, to not interfere with the ruthless balance of the world he had chosen to live in. But another part, one he had long since buried beneath years of solitude, told him he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. His gaze flickered to the cubs again, their bodies curled so tightly together that they almost seemed like one single, shivering mass of fur. They wouldn't make it through the night. He knew it as certainly as he knew his own breath, as certainly as he knew that stepping aside, allowing them in, was the most reckless, dangerous thing he could possibly do. And yet, before he had fully made the decision, before he had even allowed himself to consider the consequences, his body was already moving. Without a word, without even knowing why, Evan took a step back, his boots scraping softly against the wooden floor. The doorway remained open, the warmth from the fire spilling out in golden waves. And for a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. The mother bear remained where she was, her dark eyes fixed on his, as if she were trying to decide whether to trust him, whether to take the risk that could mean life or death for her cubs. The wind howled louder, carrying with it the bone-deep chill of the Alaskan night, and something in her seemed to shift. She inhaled deeply, lifting her head just slightly, and then, slowly, carefully, she took a single step forward. Evan's grip on the rifle tightened, but he didn't raise it. He didn't move. The bear's massive paws landed softly against the wooden porch, her weight barely making a sound despite her size. The cubs hesitated for only a moment before stumbling after her, their tiny bodies shuddering from the cold. They stepped onto the blanket he had left for them, pressing against it, instinctively seeking its warmth. Evan swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pulse hammering against his ribs. This was it. This was the moment where everything could go wrong, where instinct could override reason, where he could regret every single decision that had led him to this point. The mother bear took another step, her body half-turned as if still unsure, still weighing the risk. But she didn't stop. She moved forward, cautiously but deliberately, her muscles coiled like a wound spring, prepared to react at the first sign of danger. Evan remained utterly still, watching, waiting. The fire crackled behind him, its heat spreading through the cabin, and the warmth must have reached the bear's frozen body because she let out a slow, deep exhale, her breath swirling like mist in the dim light. The cubs pressed closer to her legs, their shivering beginning to subside, their tiny eyes flickering open and shut as exhaustion tugged at them. Evan took another step back, his rifle still in his hands but lowered now, no longer pointed directly at her. The bear curled slightly, positioning herself between him and the cubs, as if making it clear that she would tolerate his presence, but only as long as he understood that her priority would always be them. Evan let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This was insanity. This was reckless. This was against every instinct, every rule of survival he had ever learned. But as he watched the cubs slowly settle, their tiny bodies finally still, finally warm, he knew that for the first time in years, he had made the right choice. The wind howled through the trees with a banshee's wail, shaking the sturdy walls of the cabin, rattling the frosted windows, and sending icy drafts slithering through the smallest cracks like ghostly fingers. The storm outside was relentless, a force of nature that cared nothing for man or beast, swallowing the world in a swirling, merciless white. Snow piled high against the door, the sky beyond the glass a furious blur of movement, an endless, shifting wall of ice and wind that blurred the horizon into nothingness. It was the kind of night that killed without hesitation, the kind that smothered life in an unfeeling, frozen embrace. But inside the cabin, wrapped in the warm glow of the fire, there was life. Fragile, tense, and unnatural as it was, it existed, suspended in the heavy silence that had settled over the small room. Evan sat on the edge of his cot, his back pressed against the log wall, rifle resting loosely across his lap. Though his fingers still curled around it out of habit, his muscles coiled tight, ready. His heart had slowed from the initial pounding adrenaline rush, but it had yet to find a rhythm that felt entirely normal. Nothing about this was normal. A mother bear, massive and powerful, lay only a few feet away, her body half curled around her cubs, their tiny forms nestled against the thick fur of her belly, rising and falling with a deep, steady breath of exhaustion. The fire crackled softly, the warmth of it reaching out and wrapping around them all, chasing away the cruel bite of the night. But it could not dispel the tension in the air, the awareness that neither predator nor man knew exactly what to make of this impossible moment. Evan had expected her to resist, to fight, to at least test the boundaries of their uneasy truce, but she had done none of those things. She had simply lain down, her massive paws stretched before her, her ears flicking occasionally at the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin. But otherwise, she remained still, breathing, watching. She was not sleeping. No, he could see it in the way her dark eyes flickered toward him whenever he so much as shifted. He knew she was waiting, just as he was. Neither of them trusted this fragile arrangement. And yet here they were, caught in a limbo between instinct and necessity. She was a mother, driven by a need greater than her own survival. And he didn't even know what he was anymore. A fool, perhaps. A man who had spent too long in the wilderness, long enough to let something like this happen, long enough to look at a wild animal and feel something he did not want to name. He should have turned her away. He should have shut the door and let the storm take its due, let nature do what it always did, weed out the weak, strip away everything that could not endure. That was the way of the world, the way he had accepted when he first came out here, when he had chosen a life that did not require the complications of mercy. But when he had looked into the bear's eyes, when he had seen the way she shielded her cubs against the wind, something inside him had betrayed him. He had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the decision had already been made. The cabin smelled different now. The heavy, musky scent of damp fur mixed with the lingering traces of burning wood, of pine and ash, and the faintest traces of cold that still clung to their bodies. The floor creaked beneath the shifting weight of the bear as she adjusted her position, curling more tightly around her cubs, her breath steady and slow. One of the little ones let out a small, contented whimper, its tiny body burrowing deeper into her warmth, its fur still clumped with bits of melting frost. Evan watched them, his throat tightening against an unfamiliar feeling, something raw and uninvited that he didn't have the words for. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that solitude was not just a choice, but a necessity. People disappointed, people lied, people left when it became too much effort to stay. He had built his life out here to escape all of that, to become something beyond the tangled mess of expectations and failures that had defined him for so long. He had made peace with it, or at least he thought he had. But watching the cubs, their tiny, trusting bodies press so instinctively against the only source of safety they had ever known, he felt something twist inside him, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long, long time. The wind slammed against the cabin again, a violent gust that made the wooden beams groan under its force, and Evan tensed despite himself, his fingers twitching against the stock of his rifle. The bear did not react beyond the slight flick of an ear, as if she, too, had spent too many nights listening to the howling of the wind, knowing it could do nothing to her that it had not already tried. It was a strange thing, this moment, this shared shelter, this unspoken agreement between two creatures who should have been enemies but weren't. Not yet. Not tonight. Evan exhaled slowly, letting his head fall back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the mother bear. She was watching him too, though her gaze was different now, less sharp, less calculating. She was tired, worn down by the fight of survival, the endless battle against a world that gave nothing freely. He understood that. He had lived it, and maybe that was why he hadn't turned her away. He had told himself that he had let them in because of the storm, because it was the practical thing to do, because they wouldn't have lasted until morning. That was the excuse he clung to. But the truth, the one he did not want to name, was simpler than that. He had done it because he knew what it felt like to have nothing. He had done it because, For the first time in as long as he could remember, he saw something in another living being that he recognized in himself. Loneliness. It was an absurd thought, one he should have cast aside the moment it entered his mind, but it lingered, stubborn and unshaken. He had never believed that animals felt things the way people did, not in the way that mattered, but looking at her now, he wasn't sure anymore. There was something in her eyes, something deeper than instinct, something that looked uncomfortably like understanding. The fire crackled, the storm raged, and in the small space between them, the silence stretched, heavy and fragile, a thread pulled too tight, waiting to snap. But it didn't. It only held, stretching between them, man and beast, neither trusting, neither surrendering, but neither willing to break whatever fragile thing had formed in the wake of the impossible. Evan shifted slightly, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him, the warmth of the fire lulling his body towards sleep even as his mind resisted. He knew he wouldn't rest easily tonight. He knew he would wake at the slightest sound, that his rifle would remain within reach, that he would not let himself forget what she was capable of. But for now, just for this moment, they would share the shelter. The bear closed her eyes. Evan let out a slow, measured breath. And outside, the storm raged on. The storm had not relented. All through the night, it raged outside, pounding the cabin with howling winds and an endless torrent of snow, a force of nature so brutal that even the thick wooden walls seemed to groan under its weight. The wind whistled through the gaps in the logs, slipping in like an icy breath against Evan's skin, but the fire still burned, fighting back the cold with flickering determination. Inside, the small space had grown stiflingly warm, the presence of the mother bear and her cubs turning the air thick with their heavy, musky scent. But despite the warmth, despite the quiet, underlying tension between man and beast, there was an illusion of safety, a fragile belief that the cabin would hold. Evan sat against the wall, his rifle still resting within reach, his fingers idly tracing the smooth, worn stock. He had not slept. His body was exhausted, his muscles stiff, his mind frayed from hours of keeping himself on the edge of alertness. The mother bear had remained still for most of the night, her large, powerful form curled protectively around her cubs, their tiny bodies pressed against her, lost in the thick, golden fur that had once been crusted with frost. She watched him occasionally, dark eyes gleaming in the firelight, but she had not moved against him, had not tested the limits of their fragile truce. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the shutters, sending a fresh wave of icy air curling under the door. Evan exhaled, closing his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself the briefest second of respite. He could still hear the storm, still feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But just for that single moment, he let his body relax, let himself believe that they had made it through the worst of it. And then, a loud, sharp crack split through the air. Evan's eyes snapped open. The bear's ears flicked back, her body tensing. Another crack followed, this time deeper, more ominous, a groaning sound that sent ice crawling down Evan's spine. The floorboards beneath him trembled, and then, in the space of a heartbeat, a deafening roar filled the cabin. Not from the bear, not from the storm, but from above. The roof. It was giving way. Evan barely had time to react before the ceiling above them buckled with a violent snap, sending an avalanche of heavy, packed snow and splintered wood crashing down into the room. He lunged to the side on instinct, throwing himself away from the falling debris, feeling the rush of frigid air and weight of destruction just inches behind him. The impact was thunderous, the force of it rattling the entire structure as jagged beams and slabs of snow slammed into the floor, shattering with the force of the collapse. A furious, guttural roar echoed through the cabin. The mother bear had moved in an instant, her massive form shifting as she threw herself over her cubs, shielding them with her own body as the wreckage rained down around them. The weight of the falling debris sent thick clouds of dust and frost swirling through the air, momentarily blinding Evan as he struggled to push himself up, coughing against the choking cold. His ears rang, his vision swam, But his mind was already assessing the damage, already racing through every possible outcome. The roof had given way under the sheer weight of the snow. He should have reinforced it, should have known that a storm like this would test even the strongest of structures. Now a gaping hole stretched above them, exposing the cabin's interior to the brutal force of the blizzard outside. Snow poured in through the opening, the wind howling through the jagged remains of the ceiling, the temperature inside dropping instantly as the fragile barrier of warmth was ripped away. Evan's body ached, but he had been lucky. A few scratches, bruises forming beneath his skin, nothing more. The mother bear, too, had been spared the worst of it. Her powerful frame had taken the brunt of the collapse, her thick fur shielding her from the worst of the damage. But the cubs! Evan's heart lurched. The bear shifted, letting out a deep, rumbling growl as she uncurled her body slightly, allowing Evan a glimpse of the tiny forms pressed beneath her. They were alive, but they were terrified. The smallest one let out a pitiful, high-pitched cry, struggling against the mound of snow that had half-buried its tiny body. The other two trembled violently, their wide eyes darting around in panic as the wind continued to whip through the cabin, sending freezing air curling around them. Evan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the sting of pain in his shoulder, ignoring the way the cold was already leaching into his skin. The fire was still burning, but barely, its embers struggling against the onslaught of icy wind. If he didn't act quickly, the warmth would die completely, and with it, any chance of survival. The mother bear let out another low growl, her muscles coiling as she turned her gaze to Evan, her breath heavy, misting in the cold. She was still poised to protect, still ready to fight if he made the wrong move. But he wasn't thinking about himself anymore. They needed heat. They needed shelter. He had neither to offer. But there was one thing he could do. His mind worked rapidly, piecing together the best course of action, calculating the risks, the chances of survival. The cabin's roof was compromised, the walls still held, but with the storm forcing its way inside, their time was running out. He had to patch the opening, had to block the worst of the wind, had to stop the snow from burying them alive. Moving carefully, he grabbed a tarp from the corner of the room, one he had used to cover firewood during the worst of the snowfalls. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. His fingers were numb as he worked, shaking from more than just the cold as he climbed onto the pile of fallen debris, carefully securing the tarp across the gaping hole above. It wouldn't last forever, but it would buy them time. By the time he finished, his body was screaming in protest, exhaustion clawing at his limbs, but the wind had lessened, the snow no longer pouring in. The mother bear had not moved from her place, her cubs still huddled beneath her, but she was watching him with an intensity that sent something sharp through his chest. She had seen what he had done. She understood. Evan collapsed back against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision swimming from the effort. His cabin was damaged, his body was battered, and the bear was still here. But for now, for this one moment, they had survived. The wind had not let up. It screamed through the shattered roof, slipping through every crack and crevice, sending cruel tendrils of ice curling through the cabin, stripping away what little warmth the fire still offered. Snow, relentless and uncaring, had begun to pile against the walls, settling in thick, suffocating layers over the broken beams, over the floor, over the remnants of what had once been his sanctuary. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, a force so primal and unforgiving that even the mother bear, a creature of the wild, had drawn herself in tighter, wrapping her massive body around her trembling cubs in a futile attempt to keep them from freezing. Evan watched her, his breath curling in the cold air, the rifle forgotten at his side. His limbs ached from exhaustion, his fingers stiff from exposure, but none of that mattered. The fire was dying. The cabin was failing. The roof had already given way to the weight of the storm, and it was only a matter of time before the cold seeped in completely, before the last traces of warmth were stolen away, before the bear and her cubs were lost to the ice and snow. His own survival had always been a calculated thing, measured, methodical, a delicate balance of preparation and instinct. But now, there was no calculation left, no logical path forward. If he did nothing, The cubs would die before morning. If he hesitated, the cold would creep into their small bodies and steal the breath from their tiny lungs, snuffing them out like fragile flames. The basement. It had been an afterthought for years, a dark, forgotten space beneath the cabin, carved into the frozen ground as a last resort, a place for storage, for emergency supplies, for anything he might need should the worst ever come. He had never imagined this would be the worst, had never once considered that his last refuge would need to shelter not just himself, but them, a mother bear, her cubs. His heart pounded as he moved, muscles stiff, body screaming in protest. But he ignored it, yanking the old, thick rug away from the wooden floor. Beneath it, the hatch sat, barely visible in the dim light of the struggling fire. The iron handle was cold beneath his fingers, stiff from disuse. But he gritted his teeth and wrenched it open. The air that rushed up to meet him was different, heavy with the scent of earth and damp stone, untouched by the storm, silent in a way that was almost eerie. But it was warm, warmer than up here. Evan turned back toward the bear. She was watching him, her body still curled protectively around her cubs, her muscles tensed, her breath deep and steady. The opening of the hatch had unsettled her. He could see it in the way her ears flicked back, in the way her dark eyes darted toward the exposed hole in the floor, uncertainty pooling in their depths. She didn't trust it, didn't trust him, and why should she? He was not part of her world. She had survived all this time without him, had fought the cold, the hunger, the endless struggle of the wild without his interference. And yet here they were, caught in a moment that should never have existed, in a silence thick with something neither of them understood. The smallest cub whimpered, a fragile sound, barely audible over the wind. Its tiny body shuddered violently against its mother's warmth, its fur still dusted with melting snow, its breath coming in short, uneven puffs. Evan's chest tightened. He had no more time to wait. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward them, his hands steady even as his pulse roared in his ears. The mother bear let out a low, warning growl, deep and guttural, her body shifting ever so slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable. She was ready. If he overstepped, if he made the wrong move, if he miscalculated even for a second, she would not hesitate. But he didn't stop, didn't falter. His hand reached out, fingers curling around the shivering form of the smallest cub, lifting it gently, cradling it against his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the mother bear moved, not toward him, not in attack. She shifted her weight, her dark gaze locked onto him, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of her cub against his skin, as she watched him take the trembling little thing toward the basement hatch, step by careful step, his breath shallow, his body taut with the knowledge that if she decided to change her mind, he wouldn't survive it. The air inside the basement was thick with stillness as he descended, boots scraping against the iron rungs of the old ladder. The cub barely moved in his arms, its tiny paws twitching, its heartbeat a weak flutter against his fingers. He knelt on the cold stone floor, spreading one of the thick wool blankets he had stored away, placing the cub carefully in its center, wrapping the edges up around its fragile form. It let out a small, shuddering breath, pressing itself deeper into the warmth. One down. Evan climbed back up. The second cub went easier. The mother bear was still rigid, still watching, but she did not stop him. When he returned for the third, she let out a low, grumbling sound, something almost uncertain, almost questioning, but she did not intervene. He moved slowly, deliberately, his fingers trembling only slightly as he lifted the last of her young, carrying it into the dark, into safety. The cubs were together now, curled into the folds of the blanket, their shivering still present but slower, their breathing deeper, steadier. Evan turned back toward the ladder. She was waiting. Her massive form filled the space above, the light of the fire casting her into a looming silhouette, her dark eyes unreadable, locked onto him, onto the space where her cubs had disappeared. He knew what she was thinking, what she was weighing, what her instincts were telling her. To stay above, to remain where she had control, to not follow them into the unknown. But her cubs were down here. Evan didn't move, didn't breathe. Then finally she did. She moved forward, her claws scraping against the wooden floor as she lowered her head, sniffing at the open hatch, at the lingering scent of her cubs on the air below. A long, heavy moment stretched between them. Then, with a slow exhale, she stepped forward. Evan barely dared to blink as she maneuvered her massive frame down into the dark, her body shifting awkwardly at first, her muscles bunching as she tested the weight of the ladder, the confines of the space. Her breath came in short, heavy puffs, ears flicking back, tail swishing once in uncertainty. Then she was inside. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost unbearable. She turned slowly, lowering herself onto the stone floor, positioning herself over her cubs, her body curling around them, shielding them once more. Evan exhaled. The wind still howled above, the storm still raged, the cabin still stood in ruins. But down here, beneath the weight of it all, they were safe. For now. The storm had howled through the night, a relentless force of wind and ice that battered the cabin from all sides, shaking the walls, creeping through the broken roof, burying the world outside in an unforgiving, endless white. But now, as dawn approached, the violence had begun to wane. The wind, once deafening, had softened into a mournful whisper, the snowfall easing into a lazy, drifting descent. The world beyond the cabin was no longer a swirling chaos of white, but a silent, untouched expanse, gleaming under the soft gray light of morning. The storm had passed. Evan stood at the basement hatch, his hands pressed against the wood, listening. The silence above was strange, almost eerie in contrast to the madness of the night before. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath coil in the cold air before dissipating, then turned back toward the mother bear. She was awake, her massive body curled protectively around her cubs, their small forms nestled into the warmth of her fur. They had stopped shivering. Their breathing was deeper now, steady, no longer the fragile, shallow gasps that had haunted him through the night. They had made it. The bear lifted her head as he moved, her dark eyes locked onto him, watching, waiting. She had remained still for hours, unmoving in the dim light of the basement, her massive frame a silent guardian over her young. She had not tested the space, had not prowled, had not challenged him. She had only watched. And now, as the storm above faded into quiet, he knew she was waiting for what came next. It was time. Evan felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him as he climbed the ladder, pushing the basement hatch open. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, half buried in snow, the fire little more than glowing embers, the tarp still stretched across the broken roof, sagging under the weight of ice. Cold had settled in every corner, seeping into the wood, into his skin, a sharp contrast to the heavy warmth below. He moved stiffly, his limbs protesting after a night spent on edge, his fingers numb as he forced open the front door. The world outside was transformed. The trees stood tall and frozen, their branches heavy with snow, the ground buried in a thick, untouched blanket of white. The wind had carved strange patterns into the drifts, twisting and shaping the landscape into something almost otherworldly. His breath curled in the icy air, the cold biting deep, but it no longer carried the edge of death. The storm had done its worst. Now it was over. He turned back to the basement. The mother bear had risen, her ears flicking as she listened, the muscles in her massive frame coiling with anticipation. The cubs stirred at her feet, still clumsy, still fragile, their small bodies pressing closer to her warmth as if they, too, understood that this moment was coming. Evan stepped back, keeping his movements slow, careful. The bear hesitated only for a moment. Then, with a low, rumbling breath, she moved. She climbed out of the basement in one powerful motion, her body shifting with an animal grace that sent an involuntary shiver down Evan's spine. She emerged fully into the cabin, shaking herself slightly, her fur still damp from melted frost, her breath heavy in the cold. The cubs followed clumsily, stumbling as they scrambled onto the wooden floor, their small paws slipping slightly on the unfamiliar surface. For a long moment, they stood there, silent, bathed in the pale light of morning. Then, the bear turned toward the open door. The cold wind rushed in, lifting the loose edges of the tarp, sending fresh flakes swirling through the cabin. The mother bear's nostrils flared, catching the familiar sense of the wild, of home. The cubs hesitated at her feet, their tiny bodies still sluggish from the night's ordeal, but she did not wait. She moved forward, stepping through the doorway, leaving the warmth of the cabin behind without hesitation, without looking back. The cubs followed. They stumbled into the snow, their small legs sinking slightly with each unsteady step, their bodies disappearing momentarily into the deep drifts before scrambling after their mother. She led them forward, her massive form cutting a path through the untouched landscape, each step taking her farther from the cabin, farther into the vast, endless wilderness. Evan watched them go. The wind tugged at his clothes, the cold biting into his skin, but he didn't move, didn't step back inside, didn't let the warmth of the fire lure him away from the moment. He simply stood there, watching as they moved through the snow, watching as they grew smaller against the horizon, watching as the wilderness swallowed them whole. And then, just before they vanished into the trees, she stopped. The mother bear turned. For the first time since this had begun, she looked back. Evan's breath caught in his throat. It was only for a moment, a single, fleeting second where her dark eyes met his across the frozen expanse, where the space between them was not filled with fear or hesitation or the weight of survival, but something else, something unspoken, something he would never be able to put into words. And then she was gone. She turned away, her massive body disappearing into the trees, the cubs scrambling after her, their tiny forms vanishing into the endless white. The forest swallowed them, the silence closing in once more, leaving nothing but the faint traces of their footprints in the snow. Evan exhaled, long and slow, the breath curling into the morning air, dissipating into nothing. It was over. The cabin was still in ruins. The cold still pressed in from all sides. His muscles still ached, his body exhausted from the ordeal of the past 24 hours. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, something inside him felt different. He had always been an observer of nature, a man who lived on the edge of the wild, but never truly belonged to it, a silent presence that watched but never interfered. But last night, when he had opened the door, when he had chosen to act instead of stand by, that had changed. He had become part of something greater. The mother bear had trusted him, in the only way an animal could. Not in words, not in thought, but in instinct and action. She had let him take her cubs, had followed him into the basement, had placed her family's survival in his hands. And in the end, she had turned back. She had looked at him, not as an enemy, not as a threat, as something else. Evan swallowed hard, his throat tight, his chest aching with something he couldn't quite name. Then, without a word, he turned back into the cabin, stepping over the scattered snow and debris, moving toward the fireplace where the embers still smoldered. He grabbed another log, tossing it onto the dying flames, watching as the fire struggled, then slowly came back to life. Outside, the forest remained silent, the world untouched in the wake of the storm. But he was not the same man who had stepped outside the night before.